I'm gonna do it by myself. Everybody loved George.
But months after the crime, police say these tears were hiding a deep, dark secret.
George Young had no idea what was coming. He walked into his home that night, exhausted from another long day of work, unaware that the two people he trusted most had already made their decision. His wife, Tia Young, and his best friend, Harvey Timothy Lee, had sealed his fate. They had whispered about it in secret. They had planned every move. They had convinced themselves they would get away with it. But the truth has a way of coming out. And when it did, what they discovered left them trembling. $1 million insurance policy, a calculated betrayal, and a murder that would send shockwaves through an entire community. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was cold, premeditated, ruthless. George had no idea that the very people he loved, the people he would have given his life for, were already making plans to take his. Stay with me, because this case takes a turn no one saw coming. Welcome to Unseen Crime Chronicles, the home of chilling true crime stories that reveal the darkest sides of human nature. If you're new here, thank you for joining us. You're in for an unforgettable journey through real cases filled with deception, betrayal, and shocking twists. To all our loyal subscribers, we appreciate you more than you know. Your support keeps this channel growing, and because of you, we're able to bring you daily true crime updates, uncovering the details that others miss. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into today's case and prepare yourself, because this one will leave you speechless. George Young was a man defined by his dedication. He worked long hours, not because he had to, but because he wanted his family to have the best. Every morning, he kissed his wife, Tia Young, goodbye, left for work, and came home at the end of the day, exhausted but happy to be with the people he loved. He was a father, a husband, a provider, and above all, a man who believed in loyalty. Tia Young was a woman he had chosen to spend his life with. To those on the outside, she was charming, affectionate, a supportive wife. She was well put together, always smiling, always present at social events by George's side. They were the couple others admired, the couple that appeared unbreakable. And then there was Harvey Timothy Lee, George's best friend, the man he had grown up with, the man he trusted. Harvey had fallen on hard times, struggling to keep a job, bouncing from place to place. George had opened his home to him, offering a place to stay, helping him find work, making sure he had enough to get by. It was the kind of man George was, someone who took care of the people he cared about. For years, George, Tia, and Harvey were inseparable. Barbecues on the weekends, game nights, holidays spent together. To George, Harvey was family. He never once questioned the time Harvey spent at their home, never once doubted his intentions. But something had changed. Tia started acting differently. At first, it was small things. Staying out later than usual, claiming she was running errands that seemed to take longer than before. Then, there were the phone calls. Late at night, calls she would take in another room, lowering her voice. If George asked, she would brush it off with a quick excuse. And Harvey was suddenly doing better. He had money now. He dressed differently. He carried himself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Then came the moment George walked into his own home and saw the way they looked at each other. The way the conversation died the second he stepped into the room. The way Tia suddenly busied herself, pretending to be occupied with something else. The way Harvey wouldn't meet his eyes. Something was wrong. George had spent years protecting his family, building a life. He never imagined that the real danger wasn't on the streets, but right there, inside his own home. The dinners continued. The conversations between George and Tia carried on like nothing had changed. Harvey still came around, sitting in the same chair at the kitchen table, drinking the same beer George always offered. But something was different now. Late at night, George would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that kept creeping back into his mind, that something was happening right under his nose, that something was being kept from him. He tried to ignore it. He tried to trust. But how do you ignore the way your wife suddenly avoids your touch? The way your best friend no longer looks you in the eyes? The way whispers stop when you enter a room? Then came the first real sign. The moment George could no longer push the doubt away. It was a Tuesday evening. George had finished dinner early and stepped outside to take a phone call. When he returned, he heard voices, Tia's, Harvey's, but something about the way they spoke sent a chill through his body. He stopped at the doorway, listening. He couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the urgency in their tones. He stepped inside, and just like before, the conversation ended abruptly. Tia looked at him. Harvey shifted uncomfortably. George felt his heart pound in his chest. He wasn't imagining it. Something was happening. Something was wrong. The statistics say that over 20% of all murders involve a victim who knew their killer. A spouse? A friend? A lover? How many men, just like George, ignored the warning signs until it was too late? How many husbands, just like George Young, believed in love and friendship, only to have it be the very thing that led to their end? Tia Young and Harvey Timothy Lee had already crossed a line. What had started as stolen conversations, secret phone calls, and fleeting moments of passion had now turned into something far more sinister. They weren't just betraying George Young anymore. They were planning his murder. Their meetings became more frequent, more urgent. No longer satisfied with sneaking around. They wanted a life together, a life without George, and they knew exactly how they were going to get it. Harvey was the first to bring it up. He spoke about it casually, as if he were discussing the weather. He told Tia there was no reason they had to keep living in secrecy, no reason they had to keep looking over their shoulders. If George was gone, everything would be easier. They could finally be together. They could live freely, without fear of getting caught. Tia didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, and in that moment, the plan was set in motion. But there was another reason they wanted George out of the picture. George had a $1 million life insurance policy, a policy designed to protect his family in case something ever happened to him. He had taken it out because he wanted his wife and children to be financially secure, because he believed that if anything happened to him, Tia would do the right thing. But Tia and Harvey didn't see it as security. They saw it as an opportunity. $1 million. Enough to start fresh. Enough to live comfortably. Enough to make all of this, every lie, every betrayal, every whispered conversation, worth it. They started planning the murder as if it were just another task on a checklist. Every detail had to be perfect. They couldn't afford mistakes. Harvey studied George's routine. He knew what time George left for work, what time he came home, when he was alone, when he was most vulnerable. Tia played her part well. She continued to act like the loving wife. She cooked dinner, laughed at George's jokes, kissed him goodnight. She kept up the act, never letting on that. In just a matter of weeks, she planned to stand over his lifeless body and collect a check. But they had to be careful. They couldn't afford to arouse suspicion. They tossed around different ideas. Should they stage a robbery? Make it look like an accident? A break-in gone wrong? Each scenario had flaws. Each one posed risks. Then, Harvey came up with a simple plan. A plan that couldn't fail. He would shoot George in cold blood. A single shot. Quick. Efficient. Tia would be inside the house, acting like she knew nothing. She would make the frantic 911 call. She would play the devastated widow. And no one would suspect a thing. They went over the plan again and again. Every detail. Every contingency. Harvey would wait for George to come home from work. He would hide outside. Tia would be inside, pretending everything was normal. As soon as George stepped onto the porch, Harvey would pull the trigger. George would never see it coming. They were confident. They were convinced they would get away with it. But no crime is ever perfect, because in their arrogance, in their greed, They had overlooked something. Something small. Something they never thought would matter. But it would be the very thing that led to their downfall. How many killers believe they have thought of everything, only to realize too late that they made a mistake? How many murders are caught? Not because of elaborate detective work, but because of something as simple as a misplaced text message. Tia and Harvey believed they had covered every angle. They believed they had planned the perfect crime. But the truth always finds a way out. And their web of lies was about to unravel. George Young had no idea that his wife and best friend were conspiring against him. But the people who did know, his killers, had no idea that, soon, everything they had built, every lie they had told, every detail they had planned, was about to come crashing down. November 16th, 2017. It was a Thursday night like any other. George Young had spent another long day at work, finishing late, exhausted but eager to get home. He didn't know that the moment he stepped onto his front porch, his life would end in an instant. The air was cool. The neighborhood was quiet. Porch lights flickered in the distance, casting faint glows on empty driveways. Inside the house, Tia Young waited. She knew exactly what was about to happen. George had no reason to suspect anything. No reason to think that, as he pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, there was someone watching him. Someone waiting. Harvey Timothy Lee was already there, hidden in the shadows, silent, unmoving, his hands gripping a .38 caliber revolver. He had been waiting for this moment, planning for weeks, rehearsing every step. George got out of his truck, keys jingling as he locked the door. He adjusted his jacket, rubbed his hands together to fight off the cold, and took the first step toward his front door. Harvey raised a gun. George took another step. Harvey's finger hovered over the trigger. The plan was simple. A single shot to the chest. Quick, silent, no struggle. But then at the last second, George hesitated. Something fell off. He looked toward the house. The porch light was on. The curtains in the living room were slightly pulled back. He couldn't see inside, but he had the eerie feeling that someone was watching. He reached for the doorknob, and then a deafening crack shattered the silence. The bullet tore through the night, hitting George squarely in the back. He stumbled forward, gasping, clutching his chest as pain exploded through his body. His knees buckled. He reached for the door, fingers scraping against the wood, trying to hold himself up. Harvey stepped out from his hiding spot. He was shaking, but he forced himself to move. He couldn't stop now. George turned his head, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with confusion. He didn't understand. He couldn't process what was happening. Another shot, this time to the head. George collapsed onto the porch. His body hit the ground hard. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the wooden steps. His last breath left his body in a faint, broken gasp. Inside the house, Tia Young waited for exactly 3 seconds. Then she screamed, a piercing, rehearsed, gut-wrenching scream, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough to sound real. She threw open the front door, falling to her knees beside her husband's lifeless body. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, smearing blood on her fingers. And then, with perfect precision, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. The recording of the call would later be played in court. "Help! My husband has been shot. There's blood everywhere. Please, send someone, please." The dispatcher tried to calm her down, asking where she was, if her husband was still breathing. I don't know, she cried, her voice breaking. "Please hurry." She sobbed into the phone, rocking back and forth. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Police cars pulled up with flashing lights, their sirens cutting through the night. Officers rushed to the porch, weapons drawn, securing the area. Paramedics checked for a pulse. Nothing. George Young was pronounced dead at the scene. Tia's screams echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, some stepping outside, confused, alarmed. Harvey was gone. He had slipped away unnoticed, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could see him. At the hospital, Tia put on the performance of a lifetime. She sobbed uncontrollably. She clutched onto the arm of an officer, barely able to stand. She begged to see her husband. She wailed about how much she loved him, about how she didn't know who could have done this. But the police were already suspicious. Something wasn't adding up. Her tears were convincing, but her words were not. And then, detectives noticed something. Something small. Something out of place. Something that would change everything. The crime scene had been processed. The blood on the porch had dried. The body of George Young had been taken away. But for the detectives assigned to the case, the real work was just beginning. Something wasn't right. Tia Young's screams had been loud. Her sobs had been convincing. But there was something in her behavior that didn't sit well with the officers who had arrived that night. Detective Marcus Hall was the first to notice it. He had been on the force for over 15 years, and he had seen genuine grief before. He had witnessed wives crumbling at the sight of their dead husbands. He had seen the raw pain, the kind that couldn't be faked. Tia's performance had been just that, a performance. Her cries were perfectly timed. Her words, though frantic, lacked the natural confusion that came with true shock. And then there was her reaction when they told her that George was dead. She barely asked any questions. She didn't demand to know who could have done this. She didn't beg the police to find the killer. She just sobbed and kept repeating the same thing over and over. He's gone? Oh my God, he's gone. She never asked how it happened. She never asked why it happened. That alone made the detective suspicious. But it wasn't enough. Then there was Harvey Timothy Lee. When police finally caught up with him later that night, he looked shaken. He played his role well. Just a devastated best friend who had just lost someone he cared about. He answered their questions, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. His voice cracked. His eyes darted around too much, as if he were afraid of saying the wrong thing. At first, the detectives chalked it up to shock. But then, when they asked him where he had been that night, Harvey hesitated, just for a second, and a second was all they needed. Detectives started pulling records, phone logs, surveillance footage, anything that could help them piece together George Young's final moments. The first thing they noticed was Tia's cell phone activity. Just hours after George had been shot, while she was still at the hospital, before his body had even been taken to the morgue, Tia had made a call. Not to a family member, not to a friend. She called the life insurance company. The operator she spoke to would later testify that Tia didn't sound like a grieving widow. She sounded calm, focused. She wanted to know exactly how soon she could collect on George's $1 million life insurance policy. That was the first real crack in her story. Then came the cell phone records. Detectives subpoenaed Tia's call logs. And that's when they found them. Hundreds of text messages between her and Harvey. Some of them were harmless. Some of them weren't. The night before George was murdered, Tia had texted Harvey at 11:42 p.m. "We have to be careful. Stick to the plan." At 6:15 a.m. the morning of the murder, Harvey responded, "I'll be there. He won't see it coming." The detectives stared at the screen, reading the messages over and over again. They had their suspects. Now, they just needed to prove it. The forensic team worked quickly. Ballistic reports came back. Gunpowder residue was found on the porch, but something wasn't adding up. The angle of the bullet that killed George didn't match the position Harvey had claimed to be in. The entry wound suggested that George had been shot from a slightly elevated angle, not straight on. That meant Harvey wasn't just waiting for George. He was hiding, somewhere higher, somewhere that gave him the perfect vantage point. Detectives went back to the crime scene, and that's when they found it. Footprints. Behind a row of bushes, just beyond the porch, the forensic team found partial footprints. The dirt had been disturbed. A small shell casing was buried in the soil. Harvey had been crouched there, waiting, gun in hand, waiting to kill the man who once called him a brother. With forensic evidence piling up, with suspicious behavior from both Tia and Harvey, detectives started pressing harder. They brought Tia in for a second interview. At first, she stuck to her story. She cried. She said she had no idea why someone would do this. Then, they showed her the phone records, the texts, the insurance call. She stopped crying. Her face went pale. Her breathing changed. She reached for a water bottle with a shaking hand, but didn't take a sip. That was the moment Detective Hall knew. She was caught, but the real moment that sealed her fate, the moment that sent chills down the detective's spines, came when they confronted Harvey. They placed the evidence in front of him. The gunshot trajectory, the footprints, the texts. Harvey leaned back in his chair. He exhaled sharply. He looked down at the table, and then he said something that changed everything. I told her this wouldn't work. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a plea for innocence. It was a confession. The room went silent. The air felt heavy. The detective stared at him, letting the words sink in. Tia had set this up. She had convinced Harvey to pull the trigger. And now they both knew. It was over. The evidence was piling up. The investigators had suspicions from the start, but now they had something more, proof. And soon, they would uncover something that would shake them to their core. Detectives had already found inconsistencies in Tia Young's story. They had already noticed Harvey Timothy Lee's nervous behavior. But what they needed was something undeniable, something that would close every loophole and leave no room for doubt. Then they found it. It started with a simple request. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents, asking if anyone had cameras that might have picked up something the night George Young was murdered. Most people had nothing. A few cameras caught cars passing, porch lights flickering, nothing useful. Then one neighbor, 3 houses down from George's, mentioned they had security cameras facing the street. They hadn't checked the footage yet, but they were willing to hand it over. Detectives reviewed the video immediately. What they saw made their hearts race. At 9:47 p.m., about 20 minutes before the 911 call, a figure could be seen walking down the street. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to make out the build of the person, the way they walked, the way they carried themselves. It was Harvey Timothy Lee. He wasn't running. He wasn't panicked. He was walking away from the direction of George Young's house, hands in his pockets, head down. Calm, almost casual. He wasn't a man fleeing a crime scene in fear. He was a man leaving a job he had already finished. And just as he disappeared out of frame, the neighbor's camera picked up something else. Another camera. A business down the road had a security system that covered the next block. Detectives rushed to get the footage. What they found was even worse. At 9:50 p.m., just 3 minutes later, Harvey could be seen again. This time, he was getting into a car. Tia Young's car. She had driven to meet him. They had planned every second of it. Tia wasn't at home, weeping over her husband's body while waiting for the police. She had driven down the street, just out of view, waiting for Harvey. The plan had been to get him out of the area quickly, before anyone could spot him. She had thought of everything, except for the cameras. Detectives had already found incriminating messages between Tia and Harvey. But those messages were the ones she hadn't deleted. There had to be more. They brought in a specialist to recover deleted data from Tia's phone. It took hours, but eventually they found it. A message that had been erased just before the police arrived at the house. Sent from Tia to Harvey at 9:30 p.m., just minutes before the murder. It has to be tonight. Make sure it's fast. A second message followed. I'll be nearby. Call when it's done. The investigators stared at the screen. There it was. The proof they needed. Tia hadn't just known about the murder. She had orchestrated it. But Tia's mistakes didn't stop there. Detectives dug into her financial records. The results were shocking. Just days before George's murder, Tia had searched online for how long does it take to collect life insurance after a death. A week before that, she had been looking at real estate listings. Expensive homes in different cities. Properties she couldn't afford on her own. Then, There was the bank activity. The day after George was murdered, less than 24 hours later, Tia had accessed a new bank account, one that had been opened under her name alone, an account she had never mentioned before. She had already started the process of transferring funds. The money hadn't even arrived yet, and she was already making plans for it. George Young had been dead for less than a day, and his wife was preparing for a future without him. The evidence was undeniable. The detectives had everything they needed. Now, it was time to see how Tia and Harvey would react when confronted with the truth. They brought them both in. Separate rooms. Separate interrogations. Tia sat across from Detective Marcus Hall, arms crossed, eyes red from what looked like hours of crying. But Hall had seen real grief before, and he knew that what sat in front of him was nothing more than a well-rehearsed act. He placed a stack of printed messages on the table, the recovered texts. Tia didn't even look at them at first. Then he slid over the still images from the security cameras. Harvey walking, Tia's car, the timeline. Her breathing changed. She looked at the photos, then at the messages, then back at the detective. She blinked. She swallowed. And then she said, "I don't know what this proves." Hall leaned in. "It proves you planned this," he said. "It proves you were never going to get away with it." Meanwhile, in the other room, Harvey was breaking. At first, he denied everything. But when detectives showed him the security footage, when they placed the deleted messages in front of him, his hands started to tremble. His shoulders slumped. And then, finally, he whispered something under his breath. "She told me it would be easy." A pause. "She said we'd never get caught." The room went silent. Tia had orchestrated everything. She had convinced Harvey to do the unthinkable. And now, sitting in an interrogation room, staring at the weight of her own lies, she finally realized it was over. The trial of Tia Young and Harvey Timothy Lee was one of the most anticipated cases in recent history. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the rows, cameras flashing as the two were led inside. On one side, George Young's family, his children, his siblings, his closest friends. On the other, Tia, the woman who had once promised to love him forever, and Harvey, the man he had once trusted like a brother. It was a trial built on betrayal, a case constructed from greed, deception, and a carefully plotted murder. The prosecution was relentless. They had spent months building an airtight case, and now they were ready to present it to the jury. The lead prosecutor stood before the court, staring directly at the jurors. He didn't need theatrics. The facts spoke for themselves. This was not a crime of impulse. This was not a moment of anger. This was cold, calculated, and deliberate. A man trusted his wife. A man trusted his best friend. And for $1 million, they took his life. He laid out the evidence, the surveillance footage, the deleted messages, the financial records, the forensic analysis, the fact that, within hours of George's murder, Tia was already making moves to claim the insurance money. And then there was Harvey's confession, the moment when, faced with the undeniable truth, he had whispered the words that changed everything. "She told me it would be easy. She said we'd never get caught." The jury listened in silence. Some of them took notes. Others simply stared ahead, their faces unreadable. But in the seats behind the prosecution, George Young's family sat still, waiting, listening. They had already lost the man they loved. Now, they wanted justice. When Tia Young was called to testify, she walked slowly to the witness stand, her head held high. She had spent the past year behind bars, awaiting trial. But now, with cameras flashing and reporters writing every word, she had one last chance to save herself. She sat down, took a deep breath, and looked toward the jury. "I love my husband," she began, her voice trembling just enough to seem believable. "I would never have done anything to hurt him." The prosecutor wasted no time. He walked up, placed a stack of evidence in front of her, and asked the one question that mattered. "Then why did you text Harvey Lee the night before the murder, telling him, It has to be tonight. Make sure it's fast." Silence. Tia shifted in her seat. Her eyes darted toward her attorney. I don't remember sending that," she stammered. "Maybe it was taken out of context." The prosecutor didn't look away. "Then why did you call the insurance company while your husband's body was still on your front porch?" More silence. A murmur spread through the courtroom. George's mother, sitting in the front row, gripped her son's wedding photo in her hands. Tia clenched her jaw. "I was scared. I was just trying to understand what would happen next." The prosecutor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You weren't scared, Mrs. Young. You were prepared. You had been planning this for months. And when it was done, you thought you could walk away. But you forgot one thing." Tia swallowed hard. "What's that?" she whispered. The prosecutor straightened, turned to the jury, and spoke clearly. "The truth always comes out. When Harvey took the stand, he looked like a broken man. He had lost weight. His hands shook. His voice was quieter than anyone had expected. I never wanted to kill him," he mumbled. "I didn't even think I could do it." The prosecutor walked forward, arms crossed. "But you did, didn't you?" Harvey nodded. His shoulders slumped. "Yes." "Why?" Harvey exhaled. His hands gripped the edge of the stand. "Because she asked me to. Because she said it was the only way we could be together." His words landed like a hammer. In the front row, George's sister covered her mouth. His brother clenched his fists. His children sat frozen, their eyes locked on the man who had stolen their father from them. "And the money?" the prosecutor pressed. "Was that part of the deal?" Harvey nodded again. "She told me we'd be rich, that it would be a fresh start." He let out a bitter laugh. "But she lied to me too. She was never going to share it. She was going to take it all." Tia's head snapped up. "That's not true," she shouted, slamming her hands on the table. "He's lying." The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. But it was too late. The jury had seen enough. It took them less than 3 hours to reach a decision. When the jury returned, the judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find Tia Young guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find Harvey Timothy Lee guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped. Others wept. George's family clutched one another, holding on to the justice they had fought so hard for. Tia sat frozen. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became uneven. And then, for the first time since the trial began, she broke down. She sobbed into her hands, shaking her head, whispering to herself, "This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen." Harvey just sat still. He didn't cry. He didn't react. He only stared ahead, his fate sealed. One by one, George Young's loved ones stood before the court to speak. His brother, his best friend from childhood, his eldest son, barely old enough to understand what had happened. And then his mother. She walked slowly to the podium, clutching a framed photo of George. Her voice never wavered. "My son was a good man. He was kind. He gave everything he had to the people he loved. And in return, the two of you stole him from us." She turned to look directly at Tia. "You were supposed to love him. You were supposed to stand by his side. But you stood by while he was murdered, and you thought you could walk away. You thought money was worth more than his life." Then she turned to Harvey. "And you, my son, gave you everything. A home, a job, friendship. And you repaid him with a bullet." She took a deep breath. Her eyes filled with grief. "I hope you both think about that every single day for the rest of your lives." The judge's sentence was swift. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied. The cameras stopped rolling. And as Tia Young was led away in handcuffs, she whispered something under her breath. A guard heard it. "I should have done it myself." Karma had the last word, and it was brutal. George Young should have been alive. He should have gone home that night, kissed his children goodnight, and fallen asleep beside his wife, believing that the people in his life loved him just as much as he loved them. Instead, He was ambushed on his own front porch, betrayed by the very people he trusted the most. His wife, Tia Young, his best friend, Harvey Timothy Lee. Two people who had every reason to protect him. Two people who chose to destroy him instead. For what? $1 million. A number on a check. Money that was supposed to secure his family's future. Money that was meant to protect the people he loved. Instead, it became the very thing that sealed his fate. But in the end, Tia Young and Harvey Timothy Lee didn't walk away with riches. They didn't start a new life together. They didn't live happily ever after. They were caught. They were exposed. And now, they will spend the rest of their lives behind bars, haunted by the choices they made. But the real tragedy, the real loss, is George Young himself. A father, a friend, a man who worked hard, who gave everything to the people in his life, never imagining that those same people would take it all away. And so, we are left with one simple question. Was justice truly served? Tia and Harvey will never walk free again. They will never see life outside of a prison cell. But does that bring real justice? Does that erase the pain left behind? Does that bring George back? Let us know what you think. Did the punishment fit the crime? Did justice come too late? And if you want more cases like this, real stories of deception, greed, and the shocking betrayals that lead to murder, then make sure you subscribe. Because next time, we're covering a case even more twisted. A case where the lies ran even deeper, and where the truth was even more terrifying.